If we're going to look at Catholics and Protestants and the differences between them, we would want to use that gap area on your print, okay? Firstly, what is the one thing that makes a Catholic and makes a Protestant? There's one thing above everything else that makes a Catholic a Catholic. Anybody got any idea? We haven't really shown much.
The religious chief is the Pope and
You're absolutely right. That is the one absolute. There may be other differences, but they can all be negotiated or compromised, or it depends on the person or on the situation. But there's one thing: unless you accept that the Pope is the head of the Church, you cannot be a Catholic. That's what a Catholic is. A Catholic is somebody who accepts the Pope. And a Protestant is a Christian. In Western Christianity, a Protestant is a Christian who doesn't accept the Pope. So allegiance to the Pope, that's what makes it, okay, the basic difference. A Catholic has to accept the Romaho, the Pope. Okay, and in the same way, a Protestant is a Christian who doesn't accept the Pope. In the Western European context, you've got different churches like the Greek Orthodox or the Russian Orthodox. I'm not talking about those, I'm just talking about Western Europe right now. So in the Western European context, basically, a Christian who doesn't follow the Pope is basically a Protestant. But there are lots of other differences. So let's just take a look at some of those. One of the big differences is, you see, the Catholics did follow the Bible, and they had lots of things, but they had things that were not in the Bible as well. They thought, they developed their own traditions, their own customs, their own ceremonies, their own things that weren't in the Bible. And so Catholics follow the Bible, and they follow hundreds of years of church tradition. And the Protestants, one of their big complaints was, where did all these traditions come from? They're not in the Bible, why do we have them? So for Protestants, it was like, we just want to follow the Bible. And they use the Latin for that. They call it sola scriptura, only the scriptures, only the Bible. The next one that I put up there is not so much true now, but in those days it was very important. Justification. What is justification? Justification is, in this situation, it means, how do I knock on the door of heaven, and when the door opens and they say, well, why should you come in? Okay? What's your justification? What's your reason? Why do you think you should come into heaven? All right? And the Catholic teaching was, because I've been a good guy. I helped people, I was kind, I gave money to charity, I did good things. Let me in, okay? And the Protestant view was, no, not according to the Bible. According to the Bible, you have to believe. All right? It's not about, doing good things. It's about, I believe that God wants me to be here. So when you're out, you can take that one, okay? We're working on this differences between Catholics and Protestants at the moment. Yeah, all of those. No, take all four. They're the same. So the reason you can go to heaven, the justification, if you're a Catholic, is that you've done good things, that you're a kind person. For a Protestant, it's because I believe God wants me to be here, because I believe I have been chosen from the beginning. I've been chosen. And so my faith, my belief in God is what brings me here and why I should be in heaven. It's not about if I was a good guy or a bad guy. It's about if I believed in, that God wants me to go to heaven. And in the same way, free will was a Catholic belief because doing good things and being kind is your choice. You can choose to be kind, and you can choose to give money to charity. It's your choice. So you choose your path in this world, and you choose heaven or hell. But according to the Protestant way of thinking, no, it was decided from the beginning whether you would go to heaven or hell, and if you believe that you're going to go to heaven, you must be one of those who God decided would go. And if you can't really believe that, that's because right from the beginning, you were never going to go. The decision was made before you were even born, right at the very beginning of everything. So you are predestined. Your destiny, your umme, was decided before. Other differences, well, in the Bible it says you go to heaven or you go to hell. And the Catholics thought, and some people you say, it wasn't so bad. Let's make another place in the middle for those people. All right? And they can stay in that place for a while and be purified. And once they've been purified, then they can go to heaven. So they made this third place called purgatory. But it's not in the Bible. Okay, it's Catholic tradition. It's part of Catholic teaching. So the Protestants, of course, looking at the Bible, they said, no, there's no purgatory, there's no middle place, there's only heaven and hell. So that was what they decided. The next one is, if you do a bad thing, what happens? In the Catholic system, you do penance. Now, penance could be, okay, you go to the Shinku-sama, you say, I did a bad thing. Shinku-sama says, well, you have to go down on your knees on the hard ground, and you have to pray for the whole night until the sun comes up. And then your sin is forgiven. Or the priest might say, you have not to eat for a week. Or the priest might say, here's this very rough, uncomfortable clothing, it's got nasty, sharp parts into it. You have to wear it. Okay? Or the priest might say, hey, you have to whip yourself. Okay? All of these were popular at that time. The priest would say, do these things and your sin will be forgiven. And again, the Protestants said, no, this is a big mistake about the Bible. What you should do is you should feel sorry in your heart. It's not about going down on your knees. It's not about, punishing your body in any way. It's about feeling sorry in your heart. So penance is an act, something you do, okay, to try to make your bad thing go away, to be forgiven. And repentance is something that people felt inside their heart. They felt sorry. Praying was another difference. Catholics pray to the saint. They pray to God, but they also pray to the saints, Saint Mary or the saints. Again, the Protestants said, no, you must only pray to God. So those are some of the differences. But the important one, the really big one, would be the Pope. And there are other differences. Prayers for the dead. Okay, Protestants would say, once they're dead, God has decided if they've gone to heaven or gone to hell. You can pray all you like, but it won't make any difference. It's a kind of bujoku to God. You're kind of insulting God by saying, please save my old grandmother, make her go to heaven. Because God's already decided. She's already in heaven or she's already in hell. Praying won't make any difference. Confession of sins. Protestants don't have to go to the priest and say, I did these bad things. Okay, Catholics do that, Protestants don't. The clergy, the Shinku-sama, can marry in the Protestant church. They can't marry in the Catholic church. As you know, Jesus Kai, here on the campus, they can't marry. Okay. The ceremonies, the rituals. Catholics have lots of colour and lots of complicated ritual. Protestants, much simpler. Pictures and statues, mostly Protestants don't like them. Saying the same prayer again and again, Onaji Kotoba Nankai, okay? Catholics have beads, and each bead they say the same prayer again and again and again and again, until they go around all the beads on the necklace. Protestants say, no, you shouldn't be saying the same words again and again and again and again. That has no meaning. Whether Christ, they have a ceremony, they say, this is Christ's blood, and they drink wine, and this is Christ's body, and they eat bread. And the Catholics say that really is Jesus Christ's blood. That really is his flesh, his body. And the Protestants say, no, it's just a symbol. Okay? So those are some other differences, but they're not really so important as the first set of differences. And the totally important one is the Pope, if you accept the Pope or not. So there's just one kind of Catholic church, basically, and there are various kinds of Protestant churches. And this is just some of them. Okay, Baptist, Methodist, Evangelical, Reformed, Lutheran, Pentecostal, and Anglican. Anglican, of course, being the one that we're particularly interested in because that's the Church of England. And it's basically a Protestant church in the sense that it doesn't agree with the Pope. It doesn't accept the Pope as its leader. In other ways, it's not a very, very strongly Protestant church. It's quite close to Catholic teaching very often in a lot of its ways. So, yes, the reason we have so many different Protestant churches is because Western Christianity developed a lot of different traditions as it grew up. And the Catholic Church was the branch of Christianity that continued to accept those traditions over 1,000 years up until the early 16th century. Well, once people started rejecting those traditions, for sort of 1,000 years of church tradition, they could disagree in different ways. There are many different paths that they could take. So, although Protestants on the whole agreed that the Bible should be taken as the main authority for Christians, the problem was that the Bible doesn't really give a clear and unambiguous message. There are different ways in which the Bible can be understood. So just saying that the Bible was the main authority wouldn't really get you past the problems that come from the fact that different people have got different ways of looking at the Bible. So Protestants all disagree with Catholics, but they also disagree with each other in different things and in different ways. So this is this big change in the religion that was going on in those days. Why am I talking about this so much? Because in those days, religion was the most important thing in people's lives. Like, we live our life now, and what's important is maybe, will I get a good job, or how much money have I got in the bank, or something like that. No, in those days, the most important thing was, I will die. And when I die, will I go to heaven and be happy forever, or will I go to hell and burn and suffer forever? That was the most important question in most people's lives in those days. We don't think about life like that much these days. Okay, but that's how they thought about it. And remember, it was so important to them that if somebody said, your way of thinking is wrong, they said, no, I'm sure I'm right. I trust my God. I believe that I'm right. They said, well, we're going to burn you if you don't change. No, I can't change. I must follow my way. I still believe what I think. Well, we're going to burn you. Oh, good, because then I will go to heaven. Burn me. Try going to Jesus Kai now and ask some of them if they'd like to burn, if they didn't change their way of thinking. They say, no, thank you. Okay. Well, even Jesus Kai, even the priests would find it very difficult today to say, yes, I'll die, because that's what I believe. Right? But in those days, people did. Okay, that's why I'm talking about it so much. Not because I like it or because it's fun, but because it was the most important thing for people in those days. All right? That's why we have to look at it closely. Okay then. So, Henry VIII and the Pope. Well, we talked about this. They disagreed about the meaning of the Bible when it came to marrying a brother's wife. Okay? Henry was sure that God was punishing him for marrying his brother's wife, and that's why he couldn't have a son. Of course, he got a daughter, but he didn't care about that. He didn't think about that. He didn't think that was important. He wanted a son, and he thought God was punishing him by not giving him a son. But the Pope said, well, no, the Bible's talking about sleeping with a brother's wife while the brother's still alive. So, you know, that's not important, really, that whether you marry your brother's wife, not after the brother's dead. Sorry, Henry, says the Pope, you're wrong. Okay? And they're both looking at the same Bible. All right? And it's not just that Protestants disagreed with Catholics, because Luther also disagreed. In this case, Luther agreed with the Pope. He disagreed with, okay, Luther was the start of the Protestant movement, but Luther did not agree with Henry about this. Luther agreed with the Pope. Okay? Okay, the Pope's right, Henry, according to Luther. Even though Luther is a Protestant, Luther is against the Pope, but in this case, he agrees with the Pope and he feels that Henry is wrong. And the Bible is a very long book, and it's written over a long period of time. Understanding it is not easy. And Protestants often disagreed with each other about how to understand it. A lot of Protestants would agree with the idea that before they were born, God had chosen some people to go to heaven, because that's written in the Bible. But they disagreed about whether that also meant that God had chosen which people were going to go to hell. Some people would say, well, it's logical. If God's chosen that these people are going to go to heaven, then the other ones must all be going to go to hell. But the other group would say, no. It's only chosen who's going to go to heaven. It's not chosen who's going to go to hell. You could still go to heaven. Okay, so they had different... I know it doesn't... The logic of that seems strange, doesn't it? But that they argued, and so different Protestants, even today, disagree about whether God has chosen who's going to go to hell or not. So all through the Bible, you've got those kinds of ambiguous things that we can't really understand, and Christians are still arguing about those things even today. For example, according to the Bible, Moses went to the top of Mount Sinai, was given the 10 Commandments. Do you know this story? Moses went up to the top of the hill and God gave him 10 laws. And one of those laws is, you shall not kill. Sometimes that's translated, you shall not murder. Well, people are fighting about that today. Christians are saying, well, what if you kill somebody during a war? Then it's not murder, is it? Or what if it's a criminal and you put a criminal to death? That's not murder, surely. Well, that's what people are arguing about. Suppose you have a war and soldiers kill innocent children. That's murder, isn't it? Okay? What about if you put a prisoner to death and actually he didn't do the crime? That would be murder, wouldn't it? Okay? Well, you know, what about those things? What about suppose a woman her children are being attacked and she kills the person who's attacking her children? Would you call her a murderer? Okay? Where does this line begin and end? You know, it's not so simple as thou shalt not kill. But that wasn't the kind of thing, that's the sort of thing that Christians are arguing about today. But in the 16th century, they were arguing more about things like I said, about if your umme was decided, if you were predestined, if your fate was decided from the very beginning, that sort of thing. Had God chosen people to go to heaven before they were born? That's predestination. And whether he'd also chosen who was going to go to hell. So that was the kind of thing that they were thinking about in those days. They weren't thinking about what does it mean to say you shall not kill. They were thinking, what does it mean to say that God's chosen from the beginning who's going to go to heaven? What does that mean that he's also chosen who's going to go to hell? What does it mean that I can't change it whatever I do? What does it mean to say that God's already decided like that? They argued about whether people could go to heaven by doing good things, justification. Sorry, that's the wrong way around. Sorry, machigatteru. It should be get to heaven by doing good deeds would be justification by works, or whether they could get to heaven by having faith in God, which is justification by faith, gyaku. Okay, I put them the wrong way around up there for some reason. Probably was not thinking when I did it. So they'd argue about whether Christ's flesh and blood was really in the bread and wine. Those sorts of things that we saw in that list of, those are the kinds of things that they'd be arguing about. So that's the kind of topic that would divide Catholics and Protestants, and even divide different groups of Protestants from each other in those days. Okay, causes of the Reformation. Why did it happen? Well, we've already said that the Catholic Church had grown up over a long period of time. Can I just, yeah, that's right. So if you go back to, sorry, the prints are the wrong way round. That's all that's really happened. So it's at the beginning of the print now. The causes of the Reformation. The Catholic Church grew up slowly over hundreds of years, and it got new ideas and established traditions through church councils, and some of that stuff, as we've already said, wasn't actually in the Bible. And by the 16th century, you've got quite a lot of traditions that had grown up that weren't in the Bible, but were being practiced by the church. And one of the most infamous of these practices, infamous is like famous for a bad reason. Okay, famous is famous, infamous is famous for something bad. The practice of selling pardons and indulgences. We've already said that you go to the priest to say, I've done bad things, and the priest would say, well, you have to do these punishments to your, to make your sins go away. But as well as that, the priest would say, or not just priests, but special people would have these documents, and they'd say, well, I can sell you this, and it will make your bad things go away. And when you go to heaven, because you bought this from me, when you die, you won't have to wait so long before you can go to heaven. You won't have to wait in purgatory for so long. You can get in more quickly. This will buy you 10 years quickly. This will buy you 50 years quickly. This will buy 100 years quickly. So if you've done very bad things, please buy this one and you can get into heaven 100 years more quickly. All right? Well, of course, this was total rubbish. There's nothing in the Bible about that. And it was just a way for people to put money into their own pockets. So this was one of the things that was especially criticized. And of course, the Catholic Church today doesn't do these things. Okay? But in those days, this was going on inside the Catholic Church. And the main reason for it was to bring in money. So here's a typical picture of the pardoner. We're collecting all the money and selling these documents to people, and people queuing up to buy these kinds of documents, like you can see, here, okay, that we're supposed to buy them, buy their way into heaven and forgive them their sins and that sort of thing. And it's one of the things that Luther completely said, there's nothing like this in the Bible. It's just total rubbish. So people were angry about how wealthy and powerful the church was, and when this man Martin Luther, who at the time was he was inside the shadowing of the Augustinian Catholic monastery, and he put a list of complaints on the church door at Wittenberg in Germany, supposedly, and popular feeling snowballed. People were already feeling a bit angry, but the movement started to grow very quickly. It just seemed like he was just in the right place at the right time to catch all the anger and protest that people had against the church, and it suddenly became a very big thing, a big movement of protest against the church. And that's not what he wanted. Okay, what he wanted was for the church to say, oh yes, I'm sorry, you're right. He wanted the Pope to agree with him. He didn't expect that he would be forming a separate church. He didn't expect that the church would split up like this. he thought that the Catholics would say, oh yes, it's true, let's get rid of some of these things and let's try and get back more to the original path of Christianity. Let's get rid of some of these things that are wrong in the church, which in the end, of course, they did. But at that time, they said, no, Luther and his group of people who agree with him are completely outside our church. It's one of the most famous scenes in history that he nailed his arguments onto the door of the church. There's some doubt about whether he really did it, okay, or whether that's just a kind of symbol or a kind of legend. But it's like a lot of the famous things in history. Sometimes we find it wasn't actually true, so we're not too sure about that one. But there were others like Melanchthon, Calvin, Zwingli, also speaking out against the Catholic Church at this time in Europe and trying to find the right way for the church to go. All right, and so they especially studied the Bible and the early Christian churches, the early Christian writers from the beginning of Christianity. They felt that was the pure Christianity. And in the last 1,000 years, the Catholic Church has been slowly going in the wrong direction, more and more. So these different Protestant churches grew up. In England, we said before that Henry VIII was not a supporter of the Reformers, and that he and Luther quarrelled badly. And in 1521, as I told you last week, the Pope had been given Henry a special title, Defender of the Faith, Fidei Defensor, because he supported Catholicism and was against the Protestants. Henry was never one of the Protestants in the normal way. But after 1529, because of his marriage, Henry found himself more and more against the Pope. And in those days, there were only two positions. You're either with the Pope and you're with the Catholics, or you're against the Pope and you're with the Protestants. Okay, so because Henry's against the Pope, that puts him with the Protestants, even though basically he didn't really agree with the Protestants. So when Henry divorced, or more strictly speaking, his marriage was annulled, the Pope excommunicated him. Remember, I gave you that word before. Excommunicate means cut out, cut off, separate. The Church of England was basically Catholic, but we talked last week about these things. I'm just reminding you. Henry allowed the Bible to be translated into English, and he closed the monasteries. Remember, we talked about this last week, but just reminding you about the two basic reforms that he made to move in a sort of a bit more Protestant direction. But basically, during the 16th century, England was in a state of religious confusion. And that's what I'd like us to look at in the next part of this presentation. You start off looking at Catholic and Protestant. You start off with England basically as a Catholic country. This is at the time of Henry VIII up until 1533, when he separated, when his marriage with Catherine was annulled. So it's a Catholic country at that time. Okay, you've got a diagram here. See if you can fill in as many of the details as possible on the diagram. Might help you to remember the basic picture. And he was given that special title by the Pope of Fidei Defensor, Defender of the Faith. As a good Catholic, in 1521, the Pope gave him a special title and said, you are Fidei Defensor. You can use this from the Pope. It's a special name, a special honor for you, Henry, because you are such a good Catholic. And we're still using it. The British are still using it. Here's recent English money. Okay, British money. That's Elizabeth II now, the Queen now. Okay? Look at what it says. Dei gratia regina means that she's queen because of God. Because God chose her. Thanks to God, she's the queen. Okay, the idea that God decides people's lives or something like that, that's in there. But afterwards it says FD, Fidei Defensor, defender of the faith. The title that the Pope gave to Henry, okay, when Henry was a good Catholic. So the Pope is sort of saying, I gave that to the English king because he was a good Catholic. Now they become Protestants, but they're still using it. Okay? Probably a bit, you know, because he gave it to them for being good Catholics. So even though they stopped being Catholics, they still use that FD, the Fidei Defensor title that came from the Pope. So basically that shows how happy the Pope was with Henry and how Catholic the country was in those days. But after that, England moves into a kind of middle position. It's not really Catholic because it doesn't accept the Pope, but it's not really Protestant because it doesn't accept most of those Protestant teachings. I mean, for example, is Jesus Christ's blood really in the wine? Is Jesus Christ's body really in the bread in this church ceremony? Well, Henry had a debate with a Protestant about that one day. Okay, many things happened, but for example, he had a debate with a Protestant. The Protestant arguing, it's only symbolic, Henry. It's not really there isn't really blood and wine in the blood in the wine. No, it's just a symbol. And they talked about it for an hour and 2 hours and 3 hours and 4 hours, and finally Henry said, "Thank you. That's enough. Take him away and burn him." Seriously. Okay? He was not a Protestant. He did not support the Protestant reformers. When Protestants tried to persuade him of their ideas, he would say, "Thank you for talking to me. Now, take him away and burn him." So Henry was never really a Protestant. So the church, we can say, was sort of somewhere in the middle. And the Protestant things that happened were the divorce or annulment, which the Pope didn't agree with. Excommunication, chucked out, kicked out from the Catholic Church. The monasteries were closed, the Bible was in English. So in those ways, the Eiko Kyokai was pushed over into a sort of more Protestant position, but it was kind of somewhere in the middle. And so at this time, you got this kind of middle. Actually, sometimes Henry would wake up in the morning thinking, actually, I'm beginning to agree a little bit more with the Protestants, and the church would move more in a Protestant direction. And then a few weeks later, he'd say, no, yeah, buddy, they're all wrong. Let's go back to the Catholic. I think he was going backwards inside, never completely kind of, but he was going backwards and forwards depending on his mood. And the Spanish ambassador said, I've been here for 2 weeks and they've changed the religion 3 times already. Okay, so you never quite knew exactly what the religion was during Henry's life because he kept changing and it moved backwards and forwards. But then, of course, he died, and what happens next? His son, Edward, is Protestant, more Protestant than Henry. And the church now moves into a strongly Protestant position. Well, to tell the truth, this young Edward was only 9 years old. And it was really his guides, the kind of mentors, the adults who were looking after him. They wanted the church to become more Protestant. So they were pushing the church in a more Protestant direction. And Edward, because he was a little boy and he needed their protection, he just agreed and I think he'd been educated towards the Protestant way. So the church was basically in the Protestant, pretty much a straightforward Protestant church for a few years. But then what happened? Henry died. And Edward died, and Henry's daughter, from Catherine of Aragon, the Catholic queen, and Mary, also of course strongly Catholic, she becomes Queen of England, and suddenly it goes back again all the way to the Catholic side. All right, she's Catholic, and it's Roma Hono Catholicu Shugi. It's all back to the beginning. Everything's Catholic. And if you don't agree, she'll burn you. Okay, hundreds of Protestants were burned by Mary because they didn't agree with the Catholic position. And also you can see she was only queen for a few years. She died, she had no children, so her sister became queen. Her sister was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, and she was brought up more on the Protestant side, basically Protestant, not strongly Protestant, but in that kind of more on the Protestant direction. And this one is basically the final one for the 16th century. This is the final position that we get. It's called the Elizabethan settlement in 1559, and the Latin name for it is Via Media, which means middle way. Mannaka no michi, Protestanto to Catholico no aida no michi. And the Eikoku Kyokai, the Church of England, has always been this kind of middle kind of church. It's not strongly Catholic, it's not strongly Protestant. It's following a sort of middle path between the two religions. And Elizabeth wanted her church to be as open as possible. She wanted to say, look, I don't want a very narrow church, only these people can come to my church. I want it open as possible. So if you're Protestant, but you're stronger Protestant than I am, please try my church. And if you're a Catholic, please try my church. Okay, she wanted to keep it as open to everybody as possible. In fact, it was fuhor not to go to church. You had to go to church. All right? So she tried to make it attractive to both sides as much as possible, make it as wide as possible, so that all different people could go to the church and not feel unhappy about it. They could all feel, well, it's daitai, it's okay. It's mostly, it sort of fits with a wide variety of people's beliefs. So that's the position that you've got over this period. Let's take a look at it again. Starts off Catholic. Then you get the annulment of the marriage. Then it becomes Protestant. Then it goes back to being Catholic, and then it goes back to being sort of in between Protestant and Catholic. So we've got these, okay? We've got this kind of pattern going across the 16th century. All right? Okay? Must have been very confusing for people. They'd wake up in the morning and say, okay, what religion is it today? Okay? And it mattered. It made a big difference, because if you got the wrong religion, you could be punished. Okay? So that's how the church developed in the 16th century. This stabilized things. The Elizabethan settlement made the situation stable, and then in the 17th century, the totemo protestanto tekina protestanto, the Puritans, the very strong Protestants, they took control in the middle of the 17th century, and the church became very strongly Protestant again in the 17th century for a short time. But daitai, imamade, right up until today, the church is this via media, middle way. It's not a strongly Protestant church like well, like those churches in America where they don't believe in evolution, and the first thing people say to you is, "Are you saved? Are you going to go to heaven when you die?" Okay, the British don't do that mostly. It's not very English to talk like that. All right, most of those strongly Puritan British people left and went to America. So you've got it in America today. You don't have that kind of thinking very much in England or Britain. And on the other hand, there are not so many English Catholics, and there are some, okay, but they tend to prefer this sort of middle kind of, not very strongly Protestant, not very strongly Catholic religion. Okay, that's the. But these days, if you go to Britain today, you're going to find it's a little bit like Japan for most people. Religion isn't terribly important anyway. You go to the church on Sunday and it's mostly empty. Okay, just a few people. Depends, of course. There are some famous churches that fill up on a Sunday, but it's not like 100 years ago, and certainly not like the 16th century when everybody went to church. So, okay, basically then that's the way things were. We talk about the Reformation. When I was your age, at school or at university, they said, the Reformation happened, in 1530 something in England. It began in Europe in 1517. Okay, 500 years ago this year. Okay, and that was it. The Reformation just happened. They don't teach it like that now. They say the Reformation was a long, slow process that happened very slowly, and it went backwards and forwards, like we're seeing in England there. They talk about the Reformation as a long process. They talk about the long Reformation. So, lots of scholars especially in the last 20 years, scholars have been emphasizing, is this on your print? The long Reformation? Yeah, good. They've been emphasizing that the Reformation was not something that just suddenly happened, but it was a long, slow process with its roots in the 14th century and carried on with changes and developments up into the 18th century. It happened for over about 400 years, this Reformation. It wasn't just, like I learned in school, it wasn't just 1517, and in like kind of between this period from about here to here, from 1517 to 1540 or something, and it was all over. Okay, now people are saying no, the Reformation goes, it goes back to sort of, okay, there's kind of 400 or 500 years where slowly Reformation is taking place. There was a lot more activity here, and things really started to happen, but it's something that covers a much bigger period. So if you're interested in the Reformation, the long Reformation is the fashionable one these days. The one I learned about when I was your age was that it all happened here. Okay, so history changes. Okay, the history that you're learning now, maybe in a few years' time, people say, no, that was a mistake. We found new information. We've got a new way of understanding it. So history is not kanteki. It's always, how do we understand the past? Okay? And especially, looking at England, it's not true that, again, what I was taught was in 1533, okay, England became Protestant. Okay, England chose the Protestant direction. That's what I was taught. And then afterwards, Mary brought the church back to the Catholic way. And the whole of England was terribly unhappy at this time. And when she died, and it went back to Protestant, or went back to the middle kind of way, Elizabeth making it kind of via media, middle Protestant. Everybody was so happy because the Catholic Queen was dead. A lot of English people were very happy to be Catholics. In fact, they're probably happier being Catholics. Because what happens when they stop being Catholics and they're told the Catholic way is wrong, they say, okay? Where will my mother and father and my grandparents be when if they were following the wrong church, they won't have gone to heaven. I want to go to the same heaven where my mum and dad are. All right, I don't want to go to the Protestant heaven, I want to go to the Catholic one. So probably actually most of Britain was quite happy being, most of England was relatively happy being Catholic at that time. So again, I probably learned a wrong explanation that after Mary died, England was, yay, we're back to Protestantism. Oh, we're so happy we don't have that horrible Catholic Queen burning us anymore. Actually, a lot of people were very sad. And they wanted it was not easy for Elizabeth to make her via media Protestant kind of church. It was not easy. It was a long struggle. So again, that's something that people are still debating. But it looks like the way I learned it when I was at school was wrong, basically. And they've changed their minds about it. And they've got a position much more of a long struggle that Elizabeth had to establish her middle way church. It wasn't an easy thing for her to do. And also, this is my own sort of senmong. I'm not Catholic and I'm not Protestant, but I've studied a lot about Catholic literature in Protestant England, and there was a lot of it. They brought a lot of Catholic literature. They would change things to make it okay for Protestant readers. They brought it in from Spain, from France, from some of it from Latin, from different parts of Europe. They brought in a lot of Catholic literature into England at that time, just changing it a little bit so that Protestants could read it safely. The question of what Shakespeare is like the most famous person from that kind of period in the most famous writer in English and everything, and it's of special interest for this university. You probably don't even know, but maybe one of the most famous people of Sophia University died. His name was Peter Millward. He was very, very famous. Jesus Kaino Shikusama deshita. He was in the Eibungakka, he was a colleague, okay, he was a friend. And he had this big idea that Shakespeare was a Catholic. Okay, now that's really shakes English people. Shakespeare, a Catholic, our Shakespeare, a Catholic, impossible. Okay, but actually there's quite a lot of evidence that maybe he was. Now, frankly, I don't think he was. Okay, I don't actually think Shakespeare's a Catholic, but it's interesting that Shakespeare has so many connections with Catholicism, and I thought we might just finish by looking, I'll try and speed up and go through this fairly quickly. Here's Shakespeare, and here's Catholicism, and what sort of connections how is Shakespeare connected with Catholicism? What's the relationship? Okay. Well, there are lots of connections. Okay? His mother came from a very Catholic family. His hometown, Stratford, was a very Catholic area. The school he went to had Catholic teachers, and some of the students were Catholics. So when he was 10 years old, his cousin had his head chopped off for helping a Catholic priest. Okay, if you were a Catholic priest, you could be punished by death. If you helped a Catholic priest, you could be punished by death. The Catholic priest was running away, and Shakespeare's cousin said, "Come here, you can hide here. I'll help you to hide." And Shakespeare's cousin was put to death, and his head was cut off for supporting a Catholic. The school that the town he grew up in was definitely Catholic. It's also possible that he went to a town in the north of England called Lancaster, which is even more Catholic, and that he lived with a Catholic family. The names in those days, Shakespeare's name, he spelled his own name seven different ways. Okay, and the person that we have in Lancashire was called Shakeshaft, not Shakespeare. Is it the same person? Is it not the same person? Some scholars think it's the same person. Some scholars say no, it's not him. So, but if it was him, then that would support the idea that he was a Catholic, because he actually worked in a Catholic family. Would be quite a strong evidence that he was Catholic. His first teacher became a Jesuit, Yesus kai ni narimashita, and some of the students, one of his dokyusei, became a Catholic priest. So strong Catholic connections from his school. When the father wrote a will saying, my property should go to, and it was written in the Catholic way. But the problem is the will was discovered after a long time later, and then the will was destroyed in a fire. So we can't really check that information. His wedding, Shakespeare's wedding, was at a church where the Shimpu-sama, the priest, was said to have Catholic sympathies. And his father and daughter were both fined for not going to church. If you didn't go to church, you had to pay money. And they both didn't go to church. Was that because they were Catholics? Okay, but it's possible. One of the major reasons for not going to church was because he were a Catholic. And his father and his daughter both didn't go to church and had to pay, a punishment. He might have been a Catholic. We saw how he wrote those words, bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang, in his poetry. It's kind of zanmen, okay? ちょっとその前可愛い音楽が綺麗な音楽があったのに今すべて壊してる。It sounds like he's sad about it. Okay, and if you can feel sorry, you might cry about it. He writes in his play Henry VIII. So again, he seems to be sorry about losing the monasteries. There was a famous Shimpu-sama called Robert Parsons, and again, there's quite a close link between Parsons and Shakespeare. Shakespeare actually mentions Parsons in his plays a couple of times. In Love's Labour's Lost and Twelfth Night, in two of his plays, he mentions him. And it's clear that he read Parsons' work. But and also Parsons mentions Shakespeare. So they both talk about each other. Did they know each other personally, or just because they were famous people from that time? We can't be sure. And another famous person from that time, a man very famous for making the maps of England in those days, he also comments on these two together. He talks about this papist, kono Roma ho shugi no Parsons, and his poet Shakespeare, Futaritomo Usotsuki. Okay, so he attacks them both as being Catholics. So that's the kind of relationship that you're getting. There's quite a lot of stuff coming up from the time that would suggest that Shakespeare may have been a Catholic. Hello? But was he actually a Catholic? And as I said before, personally, I'll finish this up fairly quickly, I don't think so. Okay? Why not? Well, the reason I would say is because everybody in those days, or nearly everybody, had a father who was Catholic. I mean, the religion had only just changed. Nearly everybody had a father who was Catholic. Elizabeth herself had and Henry was Catholic, wasn't he? The Pope gave him that special honour. So everybody would know somebody who'd been a Catholic. Everybody would have connections with Catholicism. Everybody would write about it in their writing, and sometimes they would feel zaneng about parts of it. Losing the monasteries. You don't have to be a Catholic to feel sad about beautiful singing, do you? Getting lost. It was beautiful singing. Okay? And also, they provided charity and did other things that were helpful for society. He could feel sorry about the monasteries closing, but not because he was himself a Catholic. Okay? So I think that Father Millward is wrong, but it's still, he's famous. So my conclusion is, again, I don't want to spend much time here because it's getting late. You can check that through on the print or something. But Queen Elizabeth, her tokucho, her special quality in the religion was, I don't want to know what's in your heart. If you are secretly Catholic, okay. If you are Puritan, okay. Just come to my church. That's all I ask. What you secretly have in your heart is kankenai for me. I'm not going to push you. I can't change your heart. Just please come to my church. That's all she said. Okay? And Shakespeare did. Okay? He was never punished for not going to church. Okay? He went. So I would say basically Shakespeare was, like many people in those days, he would wake up in the morning thinking, oh, would it be easier for me to go to heaven if I'm a Catholic? He probably woke up sometimes in the morning thinking like that. Other days he'd think, oh, I don't care. I just want bacon for my breakfast. Okay? And some days the religious question will be important to him, sometimes not. But I don't think that he was like a strongly Catholic kind of person. The things he wrote are too many and too different to think that he was just inside the Catholic way of thinking. So for me, I would say, he's not a Catholic, but he's a good example of people at that time. Everybody would be like him. Many people would be like him. Sometimes thinking, oh, should I be a Catholic? Maybe that's better. Or maybe the Protestant way is better. Or anyway, I'm hungry and I want my breakfast. And not, I'm just trying to help you to understand what it would be like for ordinary people, and Shakespeare would just be like a typical person in that sense. Okay. So yeah, I did that last part very quickly. Apart from anything else, you are not Bungaku students, so you may be not too interested in Shakespeare anyway. But the basic idea of the Catholic and Protestant in those days, I hope this lesson has given you a much clearer understanding, and you understand a little bit about why it was important for people and what they thought about. Okay? The bell's gone, and we're finished for this week.